Our border was open, and because of this, our country was being invaded by an army of 25 million people, many who came from prisons and jails, mental institutions, and insane asylums. They were drug dealers, gang members, and even 11,888 murderers, more than 50% of whom killed more than one person. This is what the Biden administration allowed to happen to our country, and it can never be allowed to happen again. We had men playing in women's sports, transgender for everybody, crime at record levels with law enforcement, and words such as that just absolutely forbidden. We had the worst trade deals ever made, and our country was laughed at from all over the world, but they're not laughing anymore. Over the past 11 months,
You heard that. You heard those words drip from his mouth like poison poured into the American bloodstream. And this is where we are now. This is where decades of creeping authoritarian rhetoric have metastoned into normalized fascism on the most watched stages of our political theater. Because Donald Trump claimed 25 million migrants invaded the country under Biden. And you know what that number is? It's a lie manufactured with such breathtaking audacity that it makes Orwell look like an optimist. Because the federal government recorded under 11 million nationwide encounters with migrants during the Biden administration, including millions who were rapidly expelled, and even when you add the estimated gotaways, the math simply doesn't work. But you see, the truth has never mattered to the fascist project. And I'm using that word deliberately and with precision, because what we just witnessed wasn't campaign rhetoric or political hyperbole, it was the mechanized deployment of dehumanization as statecraft. Listen to the language he uses, and I need you to really listen, because this matters more than almost anything else in understanding the nightmare unfolding before us. When Trump speaks of migrants from prisons and jails, mental institutions and insane asylums, he's deploying what scholars of authoritarian movements call the rhetoric of contamination, and Trump's language surrounding immigrants focused heavily on using non-human language to describe their actions and migrations, assigning criminality and viciousness to immigrants, repeating stories of deaths of American citizens by immigrants, saying immigrants have values incongruent with Americans, and emphasizing immigrants are a threat to the American way of life. And this isn't accidental or improvised. This is a deliberate rhetorical strategy refined over years of rallies and speeches, because Trump has referred to unauthorized immigrants as criminals at least 575 times, as coming from prisons, jails, and mental institutions at least 560 times, and as causing crime in sanctuary cities at least 185 times. And the sheer repetition itself is a fascist technique borrowed directly from 20th century totalitarian playbooks, where the big lie requires constant repetition until it saturates the collective consciousness. But here's what should chill you to your absolute core, and I promise you this analysis is building to something that should terrify every person who values human dignity. Despite several horrifying high-profile incidents, there is no evidence of a migrant-driven crime wave in the United States, and studies show that in Texas, where police do record immigration status, migrants commit fewer crimes per capita, and in fact, as the immigrant share of the population grew from 6.2% in 1980 to 13.9% in 2022, the total crime rate dropped by 60.4%, and economists analyzed 150 years of U.S. Census data and found immigrants were consistently less likely to be incarcerated than people born in the U.S., So when Trump fabricates this narrative of murderous hordes pouring across the border, he's not mistaken, he's not exaggerating, he's constructing a permission structure for violence. The pacificity of his claims reveals the propaganda technique at work, because he says precisely, 11,888 murderers, more than 50% of whom killed more than one person, and that number, that oddly specific statistic, is designed to create the illusion of factual authority, when in reality studies have shown that American citizens were more likely to commit crimes than new migrant arrivals, and immigrants in the United States commit crimes at lower rates than the U.S. per full-born population. And this reality of reduced criminality holds across immigrant groups, including unauthorized immigrants, but fascism has never required truth. It only requires the emotional resonance of fear weaponized into political power, and Trump understands this at a visceral level, which is why dictators and authoritarians have long used this rhetoric, because they've found it to be effective, as the words are toxic, but they work with much of their intended audience. Now we need to talk about what happens when this rhetoric meets policy, because this is where theory becomes practiced, horror, and you cannot separate Trump's language from Trump's intended actions. The anti-immigrant message is bolstered by the rhetoric of dehumanization, where migrants are called congenital criminals, lepers, thieves, unclean garbage, animals, predators, testosterone bombs, and worse, and dehumanization of others denies them dignity, consideration, compassion, and empathy, and dehumanizing language pollutes debate, blocks solutions to social problems, and can relax our instinctive aversion to aggression and violence. And this is not hypothetical because research strongly suggests that dehumanizing anti-immigrant language on Facebook posted by Germany's AfD predicts violent crimes against refugees in German cities with higher social media usage. So we have empirical evidence that this rhetoric directly correlates with real-world violence against the targets of dehumanization. And Trump pivots seamlessly from this genocidal rhetoric about immigrants to transgender people in women's sports and transgender for everybody, which tells you everything about how fascist ideology operates, because it requires an ever-expanding catalog of internal enemies and the construction of multiple overlapping outgroups who can be blamed for every social anxiety and economic dislocation. And you notice how he bundles these together, migrants and transgender people and crime, creating this totalized vision of American carnage that only he can fix through authoritarian violence. And his political rhetoric since 2016 has been based on an us versus them framework, with the in-group being defined as real Americans, and the rival outgroups including Muslims, leftists, intellectuals, and immigrants. This binary construction of civilization versus barbarism is the foundational move of every fascist movement in history. But wait, because here comes the truly insidious pivot, and this is where Trump reveals himself as something more dangerous than a mere demagogue. He moves from immigrants to inflation and pins price increases on Biden, and suddenly we're in the realm of economic scapegoating. And let me be absolutely clear about what the actual data shows, because the year-over-year inflation rate in December 2024 was 2.9%, and it was 3.0% in January 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same as the most recent available rate in September 2025, and that's the same. Even though the year-over-year inflation rate hit about a 40-year high during the Biden administration in June 2022 at 9.1%, the cumulative increase in prices from the beginning of the Biden administration to the end was not the worst in U.S. history, and in fact, the worst inflation occurred after World War I, when the largest 12-month price increase was 23.7% from June 1919 to June 1920, and from March 1979 to March 1980 overall, inflation rose 14.8%. So Trump is lying about inflation just as systematically as he lies about immigration. Consumer Price Index data shows that a far greater number of grocery items have increased in price since he returned to office than have decreased, and average grocery prices were up about 2.7% from September 2024. But none of this matters to the fascist narrative, because the point isn't accuracy. The point is to create a totalizing story of civilizational decline that can only be reversed through strongman rule and the elimination of designated enemies. And when you connect the immigrant rhetoric to the inflation rhetoric, you see the full architecture of the con. Because Trump is telling working Americans that their economic pain isn't caused by corporate price gouging or wealth concentration or the systematic dismantling of labor power, but by an invasion of subhuman criminals who are simultaneously stealing jobs and living off welfare, which is the classic fascist double bind where the enemy is both too strong and too weak, both lazy and threatening, both incompetent and cunning. And here's the bombshell that should detonate in your brain. Illegal immigration has generally been dropping since March 2024 and dropped significantly after June, when Biden implemented a policy limiting people's ability to apply for asylum at the southwest border, which means Trump inherited a border situation that was already improving. Since Biden's June asylum policy, Border Patrol encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border dropped sharply from more than 117,000 in May to fewer than 54,000 in September, and from July to September monthly Border Patrol encounter counts have been below the counts during Trump's last 4 months in office, so the invasion that Trump claims to have stopped was already receding before he took office, which reveals the entire narrative as performative authoritarianism designed not to solve problems, but to consolidate power through spectacles of cruelty. What we're watching, and I need you to understand this with absolute clarity, is the deliberate construction of a fascist reality that operates independent of empirical truth. And the first Trump term was a case study in the power of rhetoric to advance goals, even when critical policies were struck down in court or never fully implemented, and even if more extreme Trump orders never take effect, they could still create wide ripple effects because the point isn't just policy. The point is the transformation of political culture through normalized dehumanization and the creation of an emotional landscape where atrocity becomes not just thinkable, but necessary. And when Trump says they're not laughing anymore, he's revealing the psychosexual wound at the heart of fascisms, which is always about perceived humiliation and the restoration of mythical greatness through domination. The historical parallels here are not subtle, and scholars who study authoritarian movements have been sounding alarms for years because experts in political rhetoric, fascism, and immigration say Trump's language is a strong echo of authoritarians and Nazi ideology, and the deliberate dehumanization of whole groups of people and references to violence and the cultivation of hatred, not only against immigrants, but also against political opponents, has not been used successfully in modern American politics. And when academics who literally wrote books on fascism tell you that what they're observing meets the clinical definition of fascist rhetoric, you might want to listen, because historians expert in totalitarianism, fascism, and the United States argued that Trump fosters a cult of personality thanks to his charismatic masculinist reactionary, accessible and identifiable rhetoric, where his aura matters much more than the quality of his arguments in the eyes of his followers, drawing similarities between the fascists of the 1920s and 30s and the MAGA movement. And the inflation lies aren't separate from the immigrant lies, they're part of the same fascist epistemology, where Trump has serially inflated the extent of inflation under Biden and claimed this month that total Biden-era inflation has been more than double what it actually has been. Because fascism requires the construction of a crisis so total and so overwhelming that only extra-legal measures can address it, and every fascist movement in history has used economic anxiety as the accelerant for ethnic scapegoating, and Trump is following the playbook with such mechanical precision that it would be almost boring if it weren't so terrifying. The reference to men playing in women's sports, inserted between discussions of murder and economic collapse, is particularly instructive because it reveals how Trump constructs his enemies as both dangerous and ridiculous, both threatening civilization and violating natural order. Fascist politics includes rhetoric that encourages fear and anger as a means to foment ethnic and religious division, and fascism dehumanizes segments of the population trying to reduce empathy and justify inhumane treatment of them. And the transgender panic serves the same function as the immigrant panic, which is to create a sense that fundamental categories are dissolving, that chaos reigns, that only a strong man can restore order to a world where men are men, and women are women, and Americans are Americans, and the borders between these categories must be violently policed. But I want to come back to those crime statistics because this is where the lie becomes most pernicious and most dangerous. There's absolutely no evidence, none whatsoever, that immigrants are bringing unprecedented crime, and not only is crime not going up, it's continuing this downward trend. Immigration continues to grow, and national crime rates peaked in the 1980s, but between 1980 and 1990, it dropped by 30.8%, and between 2023 and 2024, violent crime fell by 10.3%, which means that during the period when Trump claims Biden unleashed a crime wave perpetrated by immigrant killers, actual crime was plummeting, and this inversion of reality, this construction of a fantasy world where all the data points in the opposite direction, is the essence of authoritarian epistemology. And when Trump talks about America being laughed at from all over the world, he's projecting his own narcissistic injury onto the nation, because Trump administration's anti-immigration rhetoric, restrictive policies, and unchecked use of power along with other anti-worker policies is weakening America's long-term competitiveness and jeopardizing jobs and opportunities for American workers. So the actual effect of Trump's policies is to make America weaker, less competitive, less innovative, but the fascist narrative requires that all weakness be blamed on the contaminating presence of the other, and all strength flow from the leader. I need you to understand that this isn't normal political lying. This isn't spin or exaggeration. This is the systematic construction of an alternate reality designed to justify elimination's violence, and Trump's vicious attacks on immigrants over the past 10 years must be understood in historical context where seeing an entire group as vermin is necessary, and Trump, using much the same ideology and rhetoric as other fascists throughout history, plans to round up millions of immigrants and place them into concentration camps, And this is not hyperbole, this is not alarmism, this is describing his stated policy position, and Trump has promised to carry out the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, modeled after the Eisenhower administration's infamous Operation Wetback in 1954, when hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and American citizens were deported, and he will give the National Guard and state officials the authority to arrest and deport immigrants living in the U.S. When you hear Trump pivot from immigrants to inflation, what you're hearing is the construction of a totalizing narrative where every social problem, every economic anxiety, every cultural friction is reduced to a simple story. There was a golden age of American greatness that was destroyed by contamination from outside and from within, and only through purification and elimination can greatness be restored, and this is the narrative of fascism, refined over a century of practice, and Trump deploys it with the casual ease of someone who has internalized its logic completely, and you can hear it in the way he seamlessly moves between topics because in his telling, they're all the same story, the story of invasion and degradation, and the heroic leader who will restore order through violence. The audience for this rhetoric is primed by decades of right-wing media that has systematically undermined faith in institutions and expertise and empirical reality. 42% of likely GOP caucus goers said Trump's poisoning the blood rhetoric made them more likely to support his candidacy, and a striking number of voters agree with this description of immigrants who enter the U.S. illegally, and among Republicans associating the remarks with Trump himself, makes them even likelier to agree, which tells you that the dehumanization isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's not hurting Trump politically, it's helping him because significant portions of the American electorate have been conditioned through media consumption and economic precarity to accept fascist explanations for their material conditions. And this is where progressive politics has catastrophically failed, because Biden has just an 18% approval rating on immigration, the lowest for any president, since the question began being asked in January 2004, and Republicans were generally more trusted to do a better job than Democrats when it came to handling immigration, while nearly a third of U.S. adults said they didn't trust either party to effectively deal with the issue. And Democrats responded to this political vulnerability not by offering a compelling counter-narrative rooted in human dignity and economic justice, but by capitulating to Republican framing. Democrats are adjusting their message again to the chagrin of some progressives and immigration activists who favor more inclusive rhetoric, which means the center-left has no answer to fascism except to become fascism light. But here's what should radicalize every person listening to this. Research demonstrates that not only do immigrants commit fewer crimes, but they also do not raise crime rates in U.S. communities where they settle. And some studies indicate that immigration can lower criminal activity, especially violent crime in places with inclusive policies and social environments where immigrant populations are well established, which means that the exact opposite of Trump's claims is true, that immigration makes communities safer, not more dangerous, that the humane treatment of migrants reduces crime rather than increasing it, that the entire architecture of his argument is inverted, but politically, this truth has no purchase, because we're operating in a post-truth environment, where emotional resonance and tribal identity trump empirical verification. What Trump is selling in this clip isn't just a policy agenda, it's a cosmology, a total explanation of reality, that divides the world into forces of good and forces of evil, and locates all agency in the will of the strongman leader. Fascist politicians typically come to power through democratic election, but after being elected, the new leader rules society, absolutely demanding loyalty to him and to his ethnic identity, and this authoritarian leader speaks on behalf of the country and aims to separate society into us versus them, and every element of Trump's rhetoric, from the apocalyptic framing to the scapegoating to the promises of total transformation, serves this authoritarian project. The tragedy and rage I feel watching this isn't just about the lies, although the lies are monstrous. It's about the millions of people whose lives are reduced to rhetorical weapons in a fascist's quest for power, because behind every one of Trump's invented statistics, there are real human beings who fled violence and poverty and environmental collapse, who want nothing more than to work and provide for their families, who contribute economically and culturally, and who commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens, and those people are being transformed through language into monsters, into contaminants, into threats that must be eliminated, and this linguistic transformation is the necessary precondition for physical violence. And when historians look back at this moment, they will ask how it was possible that a major presidential candidate could stand on a stage and deploy rhetoric that so precisely echoed the propaganda techniques of 20th century fascism and face no meaningful political consequence. the answer will be that a substantial portion of the American electorate had been so thoroughly propagandized by right-wing media, so economically immiserated by 4 decades of neoliberalism, so culturally dislocated by rapid technological change, that they were susceptible to authoritarian solutions, and progressive forces were too weak or too compromised, or too afraid to offer a compelling alternative vision rooted in solidarity and collective liberation. So what do we do? Because despair is not a strategy, and analysis without action is just academic masturbation, and the answer has to be the construction of a counter-narrative, as emotionally resonant and as totalizing as the fascist narrative, but rooted in truth and dignity rather than lies and dehumanization. And that means telling stories about how immigrant labor built this country and continues to sustain it, how economic pain is caused by billionaire tax cuts and corporate monopolies, not by people fleeing Honduras, how transgender people are our neighbors and family members, not threat to civilization, how crime has been falling for decades, even as right-wing media manufactures panic, and how the real invasion isn't from the south, but from above by oligarchs who are strip-mining the economy while directing our rage downward. The fight against fascism is always fundamentally a fight over narrative, over who gets to define reality, over which stories we tell about who we are, and who belongs, and what kind of society we want to build. And Trump's story is seductive in its simplicity and its promise of restoration through domination, but it's a lie that leads directly to concentration camps, and ethnic cleansing, and the death of democracy, and our story has to be more compelling and more beautiful, and more true, even as we acknowledge that beauty and truth have never been sufficient weapons against fascist organizing, because fascism weaponizes grievance and resentment with terrifying efficiency. Every word Trump speaks about immigrants is designed to make atrocity thinkable and eventually inevitable, and every lie he tells about inflation is designed to redirect economic rage away from its actual sources toward vulnerable populations, and every time he conflates these issues, every time he builds this totalizing narrative of civilizational collapse, he's constructing the ideological scaffolding for authoritarian rule and mass violence, and we have to name this with absolute precision. We have to say this is fascism, and it must be opposed with every tool at our disposal, because the alternative is a future where the death camps Trump is promising become operational reality, and I refuse to accept that future.